I'm Ethan, 38 male. I work as an architect, a profession built on precision, order, and the fundamental principle that a strong foundation is everything. For most of my life, I believed my family was built on that same solid ground. We lived in different cities, my older brother David in real estate, my younger sister Sarah working as a pediatric nurse, and me with my design firm, but we were connected by the bedrock of our father. He was a quiet, methodical man, a high school history teacher who valued integrity above all else. He taught us the importance of a good name, of living within your means, and of facing the world with honesty. When he passed away suddenly from a heart attack, the structure of my world didn't just crack, it threatened to collapse entirely. The grief was a physical weight, a constant pressure that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. In the hazy, surreal days that followed the funeral, my brother David, being the eldest, stepped into the role of executor of the estate. It seemed natural. He was the one who handled finances, the one who always seemed to have a plan. The three of us sat around the old oak dining table in our father's house, the air thick with unspoken sorrow and the scent of lemon polish. David, with a pained expression that I now recognize as performance, slid a thin folder into the center of the table. He sighed heavily, a theatrical sound of burden, and told us the devastating news. "I've been through all of Dad's finances," he began, his voice low and solemn. It's not good. He had some bad investments a few years back, took out a second mortgage on the house to cover them. There are credit card bills, medical expenses he never told us about. He died in debt, significant debt." The words hung in the air, a dissonant chord in the symphony of our grief. Debt, our father. The man who used coupons, who drove the same car for 15 years, who believed debt was a form of servitude, it didn't make sense. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. I felt the same disbelief, a sharp, cold denial. But David was so convincing. He had spreadsheets, printed out statements with highlighted figures, and an air of weary authority. He painted a picture of a proud man hiding his financial failures, too ashamed to ask his successful children for help. And in the fog of our mourning, this narrative began to take root. It felt like a secondary tragedy, a secret shame our father had carried to his grave. "The estate is essentially worthless," David concluded, his gaze sweeping over us. "Once we sell the house and his things, it'll barely be enough to satisfy the creditors. In fact, there will likely be a shortfall." He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. He explained that any assets, including the house, would have to be liquidated. As beneficiaries, we would be entitled to a share of nothing. In fact, to expedite the process and prevent the banks from seizing everything, he suggested that Sarah and I sign a document waiving our claim to the estate, allowing him to consolidate and pay off the debts as the sole executor. He framed it as a final act of service to our father, a way to protect his name from the stain of bankruptcy. It felt noble, painful, and necessary. We were grieving, emotionally exhausted, and utterly trusting of our older brother. We saw him as taking on this terrible burden for all of us. So, feeling a profound sense of sorrow for the father we thought we knew and a foolish guilt for our own ignorance of his struggles, we signed the papers. I walked away from my childhood home that day feeling like I had lost my father all over again, convinced that his legacy was one of hidden struggle and quiet desperation. It would be months before a single piece of mail would prove that the only desperation in that house belonged to my brother, and the only thing he was trying to hide was his own greed. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The weeks following that meeting were a blur of hollowed-out days. The grief for my father was now compounded by this new, complex layer of guilt. How could I have been so blind? I was an architect, someone whose entire career was based on seeing the details, on understanding the structural integrity of things. Yet I had failed to see the stress fractures in my own father's life. I replayed every recent conversation, searching for clues I might have missed. His talk about fixing the roof was that a hint about money problems. His decision not to take his usual fishing trip to Canada was that because he couldn't afford it. Every mundane memory was now cast in a tragic new light. My mind constructed a compelling narrative of a proud man suffering in silence, and my heart ached with the remorse of a son who had been too busy with his own life to notice. David, meanwhile, leaned into his role as the family martyr. He was always on the phone with banks and creditors, his conversations filled with sighs and frustrated remarks about interest rates and settlement figures. He'd send terse updates to a group chat with me and Sarah. "Just sold Dad's truck, got less than we'd hoped, but it's another $6,000 toward the capital loan." Or, "The estate sale for the household goods is this weekend. Prepare yourselves, it's going to be tough." Sarah and I were his passive, grieving audience. We thanked him for his hard work, for shielding us from the ugly administrative details of death and debt. We believed we were honoring our father by letting David clean up the mess, preserving what little dignity was left. The legal document we'd signed was an affidavit of renunciation. It felt stark and brutal, a formal severing of my inheritance. The lawyer David had hired, a man with a flimsy smile and a downtown office that smelled of stale coffee, had explained it in simple terms. By renouncing our share, we were speeding up the probate process, allowing the executor to act decisively. It's a clean break, the lawyer had said, and I latched onto those words. A clean break from the pain, from the ugly reality of our father's secret financial life. The day of the estate sale was particularly brutal. Walking through my father's home, watching strangers rifle through his books, haggle over the price of his favorite armchair, and cart away pieces of my childhood for a few dollars felt like a violation. David oversaw the whole affair with a grim efficiency, a clipboard in hand and a pained look on his face that I now understand was pure theater. He put a hand on my shoulder. "I know this is hard, Ethan," he said, his voice laced with manufactured empathy. "But every dollar helps. We're chipping away at what he owes." I remember seeing my father's collection of antique woodworking tools he had inherited from his own father, laid out on a dusty blanket in the driveway. He had cherished them, cared for them meticulously. A man with a thick beard and calloused hands offered David $200 for the entire lot. "Sold," David said without hesitation, not even bothering to counter. I felt a surge of anger, a desperate urge to snatch the tools back to protect this one last tangible piece of my father's legacy. But what could I do? I had signed my rights away. I was just a visitor here, a mourner at the funeral of my father's life. I retreated, unable to watch anymore. Sarah had refused to come at all, saying she couldn't bear it. Later that night, she called me, her voice thick with tears. "Did they sell the rocking chair?" she asked. "It was the one Dad had built for our mother when she was pregnant with David." "Yes," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. "Everything's gone." We cried together over the phone, united in our shared sorrow and our gratitude that our brother was strong enough to handle it all. We were so lost in our grief that we never thought to question the details. We never asked to see the bank statements ourselves or the loan documents David mentioned. Why would we? He was our brother. The foundation of our family, we believed, was built on trust. We had no idea that the ground beneath our feet was hollow, and that our brother was the one who had spent years digging it out, waiting for the right moment to make it all collapse. He was a patient predator, and our father's death had been the signal to strike. He used our grief as a smokescreen, our trust as a weapon, and our love as a tool to leverage his own enrichment. The foundation I was mourning wasn't just my father's life. It was the entire concept of the family I thought I had. 3 months after the funeral, a fragile sense of normalcy began to return. The raw, gaping wound of my father's absence was slowly scarring over into a dull, persistent ache. I was pouring myself into my work, designing buildings with clean lines and strong supports, a subconscious attempt to impose order on a world that felt chaotic and unstable. The group chat with my siblings had grown quiet. David would occasionally post a picture of his kids at a soccer game or a new house he was listing, projecting an image of a man moving forward. Sarah and I would check in with each other, our conversations always circling back to our father, a shared orbit of memory and loss. We were healing, or so I thought. We were accepting the revised history of our father's life that David had so carefully authored. We remembered him now with a tinge of pity, a man who had struggled in secret. The truth, when it arrived, didn't come with a thunderclap or a dramatic revelation. It came in a plain white envelope tucked between a utility bill and a catalog for drafting supplies. The return address was for a small, local accounting firm, Abernathy & Sons. I recognized the name immediately, Mr. Abernat. Hy had been my father's accountant for over 30 years. He was a kind, quiet man who had sent my father a Christmas card every single year without fail. I opened the envelope expecting a standard belated condolence note. And for the most part, it was. His handwriting was neat and slightly shaky, the cursive of a generation that valued penmanship. He wrote about what a fine man my father was, how he had been a loyal client and a friend, and how deeply he would be missed in the community. I read his kind words with a lump in my throat, appreciating the gesture. I was about to fold the letter and put it aside when my eyes caught the final paragraph, a sentence that would unravel everything. "Your father was a planner," he wrote. "He spoke so often of his pride in you, David and Sarah. I know the life insurance payout won't replace him, but I hope it provides you and your siblings with the security he always wanted for you." I read the sentence again, and a third time, life insurance payout. The words seemed to lift off the page, shimmering with a significance I couldn't yet grasp. My heart began to beat faster, a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. Life insurance? No one had ever mentioned life insurance. David, the executor, the man who had supposedly combed through every scrap of my father's financial existence, had never once uttered those words. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a small policy, something insignificant that was immediately swallowed by the supposed debts. But that didn't feel right. Mr. Abernathy's tone implied it was a substantial sum, a source of security. Why would David have omitted it? Why wouldn't he have included it in his detailed, sorrowful breakdown of the estate? He had listed the value of a 10-year-old truck and a set of golf clubs, but not a life insurance policy. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, began to creep up my spine. For the first time since my father's death, a genuine crack appeared in the facade of David's story. It was a tiny fissure, but my mind, trained to look for structural weaknesses, focused on it with laser intensity. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the thin folder of documents related to the estate. There was my signed copy of the renunciation form and the amateurish spreadsheet David had provided listing assets and liabilities. I scanned it line by line: house pending sale, vehicle, personal belongings, then the long list of debts: second mortgage, consolidated capital loan, Visa, American Express, outstanding medical bills. There was no mention of an insurance policy anywhere. It wasn't listed as an asset, nor was it shown as a payment toward the debts. It was simply absent. Vanished as if it never existed. I sat at my desk, the condolence card in one hand and David's spreadsheet in the other. The two documents told two completely different stories. One spoke of a careful planner who had provided for his children, the other spoke of a man drowning in debt. Both could not be true. The trust I had placed in my brother, a trust that had been the cornerstone of our relationship for 38 years, began to crumble. It didn't shatter all at once. It began with a few grains of sand dislodging, then a few pebbles, then a slow, silent landslide of doubt. The grief that had clouded my judgment for months began to clear, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp suspicion. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I had a sickening feeling that my brother was at the heart of it. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat in the dark, the accountant's letter on the table in front of me, its gentle, well-meaning words exposing a betrayal so profound I could barely comprehend its shape. The next morning I operated with a cold, detached sense of purpose. The emotional fog had lifted, and in its place was the clear, hard light of a problem that needed to be solved. My first instinct was to call David and confront him, to scream at him, to demand an explanation. But a deeper, more cautious part of my brain held me back. If my suspicions were true, David had constructed an elaborate lie. A direct confrontation would only give him time to fortify his defenses, to create new lies to cover the old ones. He had already proven himself to be a master manipulator, using our grief against us. I couldn't afford to be emotional. I needed facts. I needed evidence. I needed to approach this like an architectural survey, examining the foundation of his story for every hidden flaw before I brought in the demolition crew. My first step was to contact Mr. Abernathy. I found the number for his firm online and called, my voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt inside. I simply said I was Ethan, Richard's son, and that I wanted to thank him for the lovely card and ask a few general questions about settling my father's affairs. He remembered me immediately and offered to meet me that very afternoon. Anything for your father's family. Why, he said warmly, and I felt a pang of guilt for the deception, however necessary. Mr. Abernathy's office was a small, tidy space filled with filing cabinets and the faint smell of paper and peppermint. He was exactly as I remembered him, a gentle, grandfatherly figure with kind eyes behind thick glasses. He offered me a cup of coffee and we made small talk about my father, sharing a few fond memories. Then I carefully transitioned to the reason for my visit. Mr. Abernathy, I began, pulling his card from my jacket pocket. Your note meant a great deal. You mentioned something in it that, well, that I wasn't aware of, a life insurance policy. I watched his face closely. There was no flicker of confusion. He simply nodded. Of course, he said, your father was very proud of that policy. He called it his peace of mind plan. He wanted to make sure you three were taken care of, that you'd have a cushion, something to make your lives a little easier when he was gone. My throat felt tight. Do you happen to recall the details of it? I asked, trying to sound casual. Oh, I don't have to recall, he said with a little chuckle, swiveling in his chair to a large gray filing cabinet. Richard was one of my oldest clients. I keep meticulous records. He pulled out a thick manila folder with my father's name on it. He flipped through a few pages. Here we are. It was a term life policy. He took it out about 15 years ago. The death benefit was $1.5 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $1.5 million. I must have gone pale because Mr. Abernathy's kind expression shifted to one of concern. Ethan, are you all right, son? I couldn't speak for a moment. I just stared at him, the figure echoing in the silent spaces of my mind. $1.5 million. My brother had told us our father's estate was worthless. The beneficiaries, I managed to choke out. Do you know who they were? Of course, he said, tapping the page. It was stipulated very clearly. His 3 children, David, Ethan, and Sarah, to be shared in equal portions, per stirps, of course, standard language. That meant $500,000 for each of us. $500,000 that David had not only failed to mention but had actively concealed with a monstrous lie about debt and failure. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. the quick sale of the house, the auctioning of Dad's possessions. The paperwork we were rushed into signing, it was all a calculated performance designed to make us walk away from our inheritance while he pocketed the entire fortune. Mr. Abernathy, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I could barely contain. My brother, the executor, he told us Dad died in debt. He said there was nothing left. The accountant's face transformed. The gentle warmth vanished, replaced by a sharp professional focus. He stared at me, his brow furrowed. Debt, Richard. That's impossible, absolutely impossible. Your father was the most fiscally responsible man I knew. The house was paid off a decade ago. He had a healthy pension, a solid portfolio of conservative investments. He had no debt beyond a monthly credit card bill that he paid in full every single time. I reviewed his portfolio with him not 6 months before he passed. He was in excellent financial shape. He closed the folder, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. He finally understood what I was implying. The insurance company is legally obligated to contact the executor of the estate upon receiving a death certificate, he said, his voice now cold and hard. They would have sent the full payout directly to your brother to be held in trust for the beneficiaries. For him to claim it didn't exist or was used to pay debts that I know for a fact did not exist, well, Ethan, that's not just immoral. That is fraud. I left his office 20 minutes later, my mind a maelstrom of grief, fury, and betrayal. The unseen ledger had been opened, and the numbers it contained didn't just tell a story of financial deception. They told a story of a brother who had looked his grieving siblings in the eye and robbed them, not just of their inheritance, but of the honorable memory of their father. The drive home from Mr. Abernathy's office was a blur. The simmering suspicion had boiled over into a full-blown volcanic rage. My brother hadn't just lied, he had desecrated our father's memory. He had painted him as a failure to cover up his own breathtaking greed. He had stolen from his own family in their moment of greatest vulnerability. This was no longer just about money. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the truth of who our father was. But I knew that rage alone was not a strategy. David was cunning. He had a head start and had likely taken steps to cover his tracks. I needed to be smarter, more methodical. I needed a professional. The next day, I started my search for a lawyer. I didn't want a general practitioner. I needed a specialist, a shark who knew the murky waters of probate litigation. A colleague at my firm recommended Jessica, a lawyer renowned for her tenacity and her expertise in estate fraud cases. I booked a consultation and walked into her office with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, armed with my memories, Mr. Abernathy's words, and the single damning condolence card. Jessica was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of calm confidence that I found immediately reassuring. I laid out the entire story, from the meeting at the dining table to the conversation in the accountant's office. I expected shock or outrage, but she just listened, her expression unreadable, occasionally jotting down a note on a legal pad. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. This is a classic case of executor misconduct and fraudulent concealment, she said finally, her tone even and professional. It's unfortunately more common than people think, especially when one sibling has more financial knowledge than the others. Your brother exploited your grief and your trust. She explained the legal path forward. As a named beneficiary of the life insurance policy, which is often considered a non-probate asset and passes directly to beneficiaries outside the will, and as an heir to the estate itself, I had every right to demand a formal accounting from the executor. His little spreadsheet won't cut it in a courtroom, she explained. He is legally required to provide a detailed inventory of all assets, proof of all claimed debts, and complete bank statements for any accounts opened in the name of the estate. Our first move was to draft a formal letter. It was a cold, precise document, stripped of all emotion, citing specific sections of the state probate code. It requested a full and complete accounting of the estate of our father, including but not limited to all financial accounts, real property, and the disposition of a life insurance policy valued at $1.5 million. We sent it via certified mail to David's office. The explosion was immediate. Less than 24 hours after the letter was delivered, my phone rang. It was David. He didn't bother with a greeting. "What the hell is this, Ethan?" he roared, his voice dripping with venom. "You're sending me letters from a lawyer? Are you insane? After everything I've done for this family, this is the thanks I get? You're questioning my integrity." I held the phone away from my ear, my own anger rising but held in check by Jessica's advice. Let him talk. "Angry people make mistakes," I responded calmly. "I'm not questioning your integrity, David. I'm requesting the transparency that's required by law. You're the executor. This is standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" he scoffed. "This is a slap in the face. I told you Dad was in debt. You think I enjoyed selling his house? You think I liked watching his life get picked apart by strangers?" His voice cracked with what sounded like emotion, but I now knew was just another tool in his arsenal. The life insurance, of course there was life insurance, but it was gone before it even hit the account. It had to be used to cover massive medical bills and a secret business loan Dad co-signed that went bad. I was trying to protect you and Sarah from the details to carry the burden myself, and now you're accusing me of what, stealing? His story was elaborate and new, a desperate patch on a leaking dam, secret loan, massive medical bills. These were things he had never mentioned before. They were lies built on top of lies. Just send the accounting, David, I said, my voice flat. That's all I'm asking for. I hung up before he could respond. The incomplete accounting he eventually sent through his lawyer was a joke. It was a slightly more detailed version of his original spreadsheet, with the $1.5 million policy now listed as an asset. However, it was immediately zeroed out by a series of enormous, vaguely described liabilities: $750,000 unsecured business loan settlement and $680,000 outstanding critical care medical liens. He attached no official invoices, no court documents, no loan agreements. It was a fantasy ledger, a pathetic attempt to paper over his theft. Jessica and I reviewed it in her office. "This is it," she said, a grim smile on her face. "This is what we needed. He's committed his lies to paper. Now we can prove them false." The audit of his betrayal was complete. The next step was to dismantle it piece by piece in a court of law. With David's fraudulent accounting in hand, we had the leverage we needed. Jessica immediately filed a motion with the probate court to compel a formal court-supervised accounting. This was no longer a private family dispute. We were bringing the power of the judiciary to bear on my brother. The court date was set for 6 weeks away, which gave us a crucial window to gather our own undeniable evidence. This was the phase I understood best. It was like drafting the blueprints for a complex building. We needed every measurement to be precise, every material to be specified, every load-bearing point to be calculated. Our foundation had to be flawless. Our first move was to subpoena the insurance company directly. Jessica drafted the request, and within 2 weeks we received a certified packet of documents. It contained a copy of the policy, confirming the $1.5 million benefit and the 3 beneficiaries. More importantly, it included a copy of the cash check and a transaction record showing the full amount had been deposited into a newly opened checking account at a major national bank. The account was titled, "The Estate of Richard Miller, David Miller, Executor." The paper trail was beginning. Our next subpoena went to that bank. We requested every statement for that account from the day it was opened. What we received back was the smoking gun. The first statement showed the initial deposit of $1.5 million. The subsequent pages showed a series of transactions over the next few weeks that made my blood run cold. There were no payments to hospitals, no large checks to any lending institutions. Instead, there were 3 massive wire transfers, each for several $100,000, made out to a company I had never heard of, Waterfront Properties LLC. "He's laundering it," Jessica said, her voice grim as she looked over the statements. "He's moving the money from the estate into a separate business entity to make it look legitimate." A quick corporate search confirmed our suspicions. Waterfront Properties LLC was a holding company, a shell corporation. The registered agent and sole officer was listed as my brother, David Miller. The address was the same as his real estate office. He had funneled our inheritance directly into his own business. He wasn't paying off our father's non-existent debts. He was funding his own lifestyle and business ventures with our money. While Jessica handled the financial subpoenas, I worked on disproving the debts themselves. I contacted my father's primary care physician and the hospital where he had been treated in his final hours. Citing my authority as his son, I was able to obtain his complete medical billing records. The grand total of his outstanding medical expenses was just over $5,000, an amount his regular health insurance had almost entirely covered. There were no $680,000 in critical care medical liens. It was a number David had invented out of thin air. Disproving the secret business loan was just as simple. We pulled our father's credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. His credit was impeccable. There were no records of any co-signed loans, no defaults, no collections. The man David had portrayed as a financial disaster was, in reality, a model of fiscal prudence. With every document we collected, the picture of David's betrayal became clearer and more monstrous. The final step was to talk to Sarah. I had kept her shielded from the ugly details of my investigation, not wanting to cause her more pain until I had concrete proof. I drove to her house and sat with her in her kitchen, the same way we had sat at our father's table months earlier. I laid out the bank statements, the insurance documents, and the medical records. I watched her face as she processed the information, her initial confusion melting into disbelief, then dawning horror, and finally a quiet, seething anger that mirrored my own. Tears streamed down her face. He let us believe Dad was a failure, she whispered, her voice cracking. He let us grieve for a man who didn't even exist. Her heartbreak solidified my resolve. She stood with me, a united front. We were no longer just two grieving siblings. We were partners in the fight to restore our father's honor. The counter blueprint was complete. Every line was drawn, every specification noted. We were ready to go to court and demolish my brother's carefully constructed house of lies. The day of the hearing arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I put on my best suit, the dark gray one I reserved for important client presentations, feeling as though I was preparing for the fight of my life. Sarah met me at the courthouse, her expression a mixture of anxiety and determination. We didn't say much. There was nothing left to say. We walked into the drab, wood-paneled probate courtroom and took our seats behind Jessica. A few minutes later, David arrived with his lawyer. He looked different than I'd ever seen him. The usual confident swagger was gone, replaced by a rigid posture and a sallow complexion. He shot a venomous glare in our direction before turning his attention to his lawyer, whispering furiously. He looked like a cornered animal, and for a fleeting moment I felt a sliver of pity. But then I remembered the lies, the manipulats. Ian, the sheer disrespect he had shown our father's memory, and the pity evaporated, replaced by a cold resolve. The hearing itself was less dramatic than I had imagined. There was no jury, no shouting of objection. It was a methodical, almost clinical proceeding presided over by a stern, no-nonsense judge in her late 60s. David's lawyer went first, attempting to frame the entire situation as a misunderstanding. He argued that David, overwhelmed by grief and the complexities of a large estate, had made some procedural errors. He claimed the transfers to his LLC were a temporary measure to protect the assets from creditors while he sorted out the alleged debts. It was a weak, flimsy argument, and the judge looked thoroughly unimpressed. Then it was Jessica's turn. She stood up calm and composed and began to lay out our case. She didn't use rhetoric or emotional appeals. She used facts. She presented the evidence in a clear, chronological sequence, building an irrefutable case brick by brick. She started with the insurance policy, showing the judge the document that named all three siblings as equal beneficiaries. She then presented the bank statement showing the $1.5 million deposit into the estate account controlled solely by David. With each piece of evidence, I watched the judge's expression grow more severe. Jessica then displayed the statements from that same account, using a projector to highlight the large wire transfers to David's shell company, Waterfront Properties, LLC. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear, "these are not the actions of an executor paying the decedent's debts. These are the actions of a man embezzling his family's inheritance." She followed that with the evidence that systematically dismantled David's claims of debt. She presented the certified medical billing records, showing a mere few $1,000s owed, not the hundreds of thousands David had claimed. She presented our father's pristine credit reports, proving the secret business loan was a complete fabrication. Finally, she presented the affidavits we had signed, the ones renouncing our claim to the estate. "My client signed these documents under duress," Jessica stated, "the duress of grief and, more importantly, under the false pretense created entirely by the executor that the estate was insolvent. They were tricked into walking away from their inheritance by the very person entrusted to protect it." The room was silent. The evidence was overwhelming, the paper trail a perfect map of David's greed. The judge turned her gaze toward my brother. It was a look of pure contempt. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like glass. "Do you have any explanation for this, any at all?" David stood up, stammering. He and his lawyer exchanged panicked looks. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had built his entire scheme on lies, and now, in the stark, unforgiving light of the truth, he had nothing left to say. The judge's ruling was swift and brutal. She found that David had committed gross misconduct as an executor, engaging in fraud, embezzlement, and a profound breach of his fiduciary duty. She immediately removed him as executor and ordered him to return the full $1.5 million, plus interest, to a new estate account to be managed by a court-appointed third party. She explicitly voided the renunciation form Sarah and I had signed, ruling that they were obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation. But she didn't stop there. "The evidence presented here suggests not just civil misconduct but criminal activity," she announced, looking directly at David. "This court is therefore referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation." The sound of David's lawyer frantically trying to object was drowned out by the judge banging her gavel. It was over. After the hearing, as Sarah and I stood in the hallway, David approached us. His face was ashen, his arrogance shattered. "Ethan, Sarah," he started, his voice a pathetic croak. I'm sorry, I was under a lot of pressure, my business, I was going to pay you back." We just stared at him. For all the things I had imagined saying to him in this moment, all the rage I wanted to unleash, I found that I had nothing to say. There were no words that could bridge the chasm he had created between us. Sarah and I simply turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the echoing marble hallway of the courthouse. The demolition was complete. His house of lies had been reduced to rubble. The aftermath of the court hearing was a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The legal victory was clean and absolute. The court-appointed executor moved quickly, recovering the full sum from David's accounts before he could hide it. Within a few months, the money Sarah and I were owed, our rightful inheritance, was deposited into our bank accounts. Seeing that figure on my statement felt surreal. It was a life-changing amount of money, but the satisfaction I had expected to feel was absent. It was replaced by a profound sense of emptiness. The money couldn't undo the betrayal or mend the fracture in our family. David's fall from grace was as swift as it was public. The district attorney filed criminal charges for felony embezzlement and fraud. His arrest was mentioned in the local paper. His real estate license was suspended, and the ensuing scandal caused his business, built on our stolen inheritance, to collapse. He was forced to sell his large home to cover his legal fees and restitution. In a matter of months, he lost everything: his career, his reputation, his standing in the community. He became a pariah. He tried to reach out to us several times, sending long, rambling emails full of self-pity and blame, but never true remorse. We never responded. Our relationship with our brother was an irreparable ruin, a casualty of his own greed. Sarah and I found ourselves navigating a new reality. We were financially secure in a way we had never anticipated, but we were also adrift. The fight had consumed us for months, and now in the quiet aftermath, we were left to process the full extent of our loss. We hadn't just lost a brother, we had lost the very idea of the family we thought we were. We talked often, our bond forged even stronger through the shared trauma. We both agreed that the money felt tainted. It wasn't a windfall, it was evidence of a crime, a permanent reminder of David's deception. We knew we couldn't let it define us or our father's memory. We had to do something to reclaim the narrative, to build something positive from the wreckage. Our father had been a history teacher at the local community college for nearly 40 years. He had loved his job and had a deep belief in the power of education to change lives. That, we decided, would be his true legacy. We met with the president of the college and used a significant portion of our inheritance to establish the Richard Miller Memorial Scholarship Fund. It was an endowment designed to provide full scholarships for students from low-income families who wished to pursue a degree in education or history. It was a way to ensure that our father's name would be associated not with the false story of debt David had created, but with generosity, opportunity, and the quiet dedication he had embodied his entire life. The first scholarship awards ceremony took place the following spring. Sarah and I sat in the front row of the college auditorium, watching as a bright, determined young woman took the stage to accept the inaugural award. She spoke about her dream of becoming a teacher and how this scholarship in our father's name was making it possible. As she spoke, I felt the first genuine sense of peace I had felt in over a year. The weight of the anger and betrayal began to lift, replaced by a feeling of purpose. We had taken the ugliness of David's crime and transformed it into something beautiful. We had rebuilt our father's legacy on a new, stronger foundation. A few weeks later, on the anniversary of his passing, Sarah and I went to the cemetery. We stood before his gravestone, the grass green and fresh around it. The air was quiet, filled only with the sound of a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of a nearby oak tree. "We sorted it out, Dad," I said softly, placing a hand on the cool granite. "Everything is okay now. Your name is being honored in the right way." We stood there for a long time, not speaking, sharing a moment of quiet reflection. The victory had come at a terrible cost, and the scar of our broken family would likely never fade completely. But in that moment, I realized the fight had never really been about the money. It had been about the truth. We had fought to ensure that the final chapter of our father's story was one of integrity and love, not lies and deception. And in that, we had truly won.